Number 1.
For 16-year-old Rod Ferrell and his followers of what would be called the Vampire Clan, that blood-fueled fantasy would be realized brutally. Believing he was a 500-year-old vampire, Ferrell indulged in ritualized cutting and drinking blood, alongside more normal teenage pursuits, and in 1996, he brutally murdered Richard Wendorf and Naomi Ruth Queen, the parents of Clan member Heather Wendorf, who was 15 at the time. When Ferrell was finally brought to justice, he would drag 3 group members with him into prison and escape the death sentence by the skin of his fanged teeth. The story of how the Vampire Clan crossbred 2 dangerous elements of fringe society, vampirism and cultish behavior, forms the meat of the premiere episode of Deadly Cults, premiering on Oxygen this Sunday. At 8/7 C. Roderick, Justin Ferrell's parents were just teenagers themselves when he was born in Murray, Kentucky in March 1980. He barely knew his father, who joined the military soon after his birth, and was raised by his mother, Sandra Gibson. They lived on and off with her parents over the years, and, according to court documents, Ferrell has claimed he was raped by his maternal grandfather at the age of 5, including in federal court records. However, no criminal charges have ever been filed against his grandfather in relation to these allegations. When not living with the Gibsons, the mother and son stayed in public housing, and Sandra supported them working as an exotic dancer and occasionally a sex worker, according to Florida's Sun-Sentinel newspaper. In an interview with the Orlando Sentinel, Sandra Gibson admitted to dabbling in vampirism. As a teenager, her son followed suit. Already a fan of fantasy role-playing games, such as Dungeons & Dragons and Vampire the Masquerade, Ferrell fell in with other disaffected teenagers who professed to be living the vampire lifestyle. They drank each other's blood, wore all black, and listened to gothic and industrial music. An older boy, Stephen Jaden Murphy, told the Orlando Sentinel he sired Ferrell and crossed him over as a vampire in a ritual which involved the drinking of blood. Sandra Gibson, meanwhile, sent lurid letters to Murphy's 14-year-old brother, according to the Sentinel, saying she would be his bride for eternity as part of Vampire family. Gibson and Ferrell moved back and forth between Murray and Eustis, Florida, after Sandra's parents acquired a home in the area around 1990. While living there, Ferrell became friends with Heather Wendorf, whom the Sentinel described as a troubled Eustis High sophomore, who rebelled against her parents over cleaning her room and other trivial matters. After moving back to Kentucky for 10th grade, Ferrell would call Heather collect, running up expensive phone bills, until her parents put a stop to it, making her very angry, according to her sister. Back in Murray, Ferrell told people he was a 500-year-old vampire named Visago and began recruiting followers. Among them was bespectacled 16-year-old Howard Scott Anderson, who came from grinding poverty with an alcoholic father who abused his mother, according to Florida's daily commercial newspaper. Ferrell's behavior became increasingly unhinged. In October of 1996, he allegedly broke into the Murray-Callaway County Animal Shelter, gruesomely killing 2 puppies. According to the book The Vampire Killers, Ferrell was later arrested on charges of burglary, trespassing and cruelty to animals. In November 1996, Ferrell, his 16-year-old girlfriend Charity Kesey Anderson, and another girl, Dana Cooper, 19, drove to Eustis in Anderson's car to pick up Heather Wendorf. Ferrell imagined they would move to New Orleans and live together as a vampire family. He also thought he was saving Wendorf from a troubled home. According to court documents, Heather told Ferrell her parents abused her, and she had expressed a desire to run away from home. In a Eustis cemetery on Monday, November 25, 1996, Heather said she crossed over to become a vampire after drinking Ferrell's blood, according to the Orlando Sentinel. In an interview with Crime Watch Daily, Ferrell says he then took LSD and went to the Wendorf home to steal their car for the trip to New Orleans. "I don't want you messing with my parents," Heather told police. She instructed Ferrell, "Just leave them alone." Ferrell and Anderson entered the Wendorf's home through their garage, where Ferrell armed himself with a crowbar. According to court documents, upon encountering 49-year-old Richard Wendorf asleep on a couch, Ferrell struck him repeatedly on the head, bludgeoning him to death. He was then confronted by Naomi Queen, who had been showering in another part of the house. She threw a cup of scalding coffee on him, and Ferrell attacked her, striking her so hard with the crowbar it severed her brain stem, killing her instantly. The Orlando Sentinel reports after both victims were given ritualistic burns, Farrell and Anderson searched the house for valuables and left after stealing a credit card, some jewelry and the family's blue Ford Explorer. Jennifer Wendorf, Heather's 17-year-old sister, discovered their parents' dead bodies when she returned home from work that night. Heather wouldn't realize her parents had been killed until after she left town, according to the Orlando Sentinel. On November 27, murder warrants were issued for all 5 teens, including Heather Wendorf. After 4 days on the run, police caught up with the group on November 28. The Associated Press reported they were tracked to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, after Charity Kesey called her mother. The press soon went wild with stories of the Vampire Clan, as they were called in British newspaper The Independent. In the aftermath of the arrests, Farrell played the role of vampire supervillain to the hilt. In an interview with the Orlando Sentinel, he claimed he was being framed by a rival group of vampires, that he had multiple personalities, and that he was trying to ditch being a vampire. When photographed, he would stick his tongue out or sarcastically say, "God bless America," reported the Sentinel. Despite his shows of defiance, Farrell upended expectations when he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder in the first degree at the start of his trial on February 5, 1998. He accepts responsibility, and he wants to live, his attorney said, as his mother broke into tears, according to the Chicago Tribune. Weeks later he was sentenced to death, with CBS News reporting Circuit Judge Jerry Lockett saying, "I think you are a disturbed young man. I think your family failed you. I think society failed you." For his role in the Wendorf murders, Howard Scott Anderson pleaded guilty in April 1998 and received 2 life sentences, reported the Chicago Tribune. Soon afterwards, Dana Cooper and Charity Kesey made plea deals in exchange for reduced charges and sentences. Charity Kesey was given 10-year sentence, while Dana Cooper received 17 years, reported the Orlando Sentinel. Both women have since been released from prison. In December 2018, the Daily Commercial reported Anderson's sentence had been reduced to 40 years, including time already served. He will be 51 when he is released from prison, only 17 when he was sentenced to death. Rod Farrell held the record for the youngest prisoner in America on death row. In November 2000, the Orlando Sentinel reported Farrell's death sentence was commuted to life in prison, after the Florida Supreme Court ruled defendants must be 17 or older when they commit a crime for execution. Twice, grand juries declined to press charges against Heather Wendorf for having any part in the murder of her parents. An Orlando Sentinel profile from 2006 found her married and studying art in North Carolina, though alienated from her family.
Number 2.
On the evening of February 8, 1980, 20-year-old sex worker Karen Marsden was sobbing in a police car. The officers who'd picked her up wanted her to take them to the sites of satanic rituals she'd claimed to have attended in the woods near Fall River, Massachusetts, but she was panicked and incoherent. She claimed that her pimp, whom she referred to as Satan, would kill her if he found out she'd been talking to police. She asked them to drop her at St. Mary's Church so she could talk to a priest. The officers left her at the rectory door. 2 months later, part of her skull and other remains were found in the forest outside town. Most of her body was never recovered. Marsden's death was one of 3 so-called satanic cult killings that occurred in late 1979 and early 1980 in Fall River, a historic mill city notorious for the axe murders of Lizzie Borden's father and stepmother. 2 locals were convicted in Marsden's killing: Carl Drew, the pimp Marsden said was Satan, and Robin Murphy, a 17-year-old who law enforcement said was a fearsome pimp in her own right, and a competitor of Drew's. Murphy was also the star prosecution witness against Drew at the murder trial. She turned state's evidence in exchange for a lesser second-degree murder charge, describing in graphic detail Drew forcing her to participate in sacrificing Marsden to the devil. Both remain in prison today, despite a lack of physical evidence linking them to the crime, a timeline that doesn't add up, and multiple witnesses later admitting their testimonies had been false. Murphy recanted her own testimony against Drew at a parole hearing, saying she'd been coerced by the district attorney to lie on the stand. Now, Fall River, a new 4-part docuseries executive produced by Blumhouse Television that premiered this month on Epix and streaming on Amazon Prime, re-examines this chapter of the city's history, as well as the possibility that 2 people have been imprisoned for decades for a crime neither one committed. Using archival news reports, reenactments, and interviews, director James Buddy Day places the brutal murders of Doreen Levesque, Barbara Raposa, and Karen Marsden in the context of the rise of the Satanic Panic. Following the 1980 publication of the since discredited book Michelle Remembers by a woman who claimed to have recovered childhood memories of being abused in satanic rituals, parents and law enforcement nationwide became convinced children were being abused in the woods by devil worshippers. In the church-going city of Fall River, the threat of Satanism found an easy foothold. They just grabbed onto the idea that Satanism had to be a motivator for these murders, without any evidence, Day says. And then that colored the rest of the case. Day, who has created several documentaries on the Manson family, initially aimed to tell only Drew's story, after stumbling across the prisoner's blog declaring his innocence in 2016. Carl's personal narrative was so crazy and said so much about the justice system and the Satanic Panic, Day says. Thanks to his investigation, a Massachusetts innocence program is looking at Drew's case, with the goal of convincing a judge to grant him a new trial. But Drew's plight turned out to be just one part of a larger picture. In the years since Day met Drew, the documentary evolved to tell Murphy's story and the story of one New England city in the 1970s and 1980s, as well, where real abuse and exploitation went overlooked, while law enforcement worked on keeping Satan away. Throughout the series, viewers must interpret the crimes and convictions through the biased and conflicting accounts of more than a dozen law enforcement officers, investigators, attorneys, journalists, academics, and Fall River residents, some more trustworthy than others. One former police detective who would fit in well with today's Canaan cult even insists the threat from Satan worshippers at the time was real, and persists today, despite a massive cover-up. To the cops, the murder victims were low-life prostitutes or transients who they describe in the documentary as oftentimes drunk or on drugs. To their friends, the victims were teen girls and young women who Drew exploited. Although it seems likely Drew was not the devil or a murderer, sources who knew him at the time say he controlled the people around him with fear. Day says the shifts in perspective and credibility are intentional. Something I found interesting thematically through the whole series is how everybody has hung on to their original beliefs and was not open to considering another possibility, he says. The same sexist attitudes Fall River police harbored against sex workers may have prompted them to ignore child sex abuse allegations against Fall River resident Andy Maltis, who several documentary sources said had a reputation for offering rides to young girls including Robin Murphy before raping them. A childhood friend of Murphy's, Catherine Hindle, reveals in an interview that she had been brutally raped by Maltis in the woods, but said police refused to take her report because she was only 12 years old. Maltis wound up dying in prison in 1988, 7 years after he was convicted of murdering Barbara Raposa in November 1979. In the final episode, Day shares a compelling theory that Maltis's involvement in the crimes could have gone beyond the one killing, as law enforcement officers and lawyers describe Murphy as an evil mastermind who at 17 years old lied to put Drew in prison for her own gain. Murphy herself is notably absent for the first half of the series. Day spent the better part of a year convincing her to speak with him. For the documentary, Robin has gone through an amount of trauma that's almost incomprehensible, he says. It's really sad that she's been so demonized over the years. When Murphy finally speaks, it is slowly and with caution. She recognizes the reputation she has, and still seems unsure if she can trust the interviewer as she revisits, yet again, the abuse she endured growing up, and the false testimony she tried to take back, only to be told it was too late. The stories I told I want to take personal responsibility for, she says. I tried really hard numerous times to tell the truth. No one cares. Murphy is up for parole in 2022.
Number 3.
It doesn't matter how much scholars want to establish a line of continuity between the pre-Hispanic gods of death, Posadas Catrina, and the Santa Muerte. The White Lady is a modern concept. They call her Santa Muerte, and the name means good death or holy death. The term was borrowed from Catholic prayers, asking for a peaceful demise from this word, in peace with God, satisfied with life. The medical nation has its own word for it. The Greek word is euthanasia, which also means good death, the right to die without unnecessary suffering, be it good or holy. The concept is not new. Since the beginning of the 21st century, a bizarre cult has grown from a solitary street altar in a poor neighborhood in Mexico City to a continental phenomenon which is now studied by scholars. It is the Santa Muerte cult. Perhaps its more original feature is that, while in Catholicism the good holy death is a process, and in medicine is a procedure, the cult of Santa Muerte turned it into a person. Its acolytes say that deep down it's the same thing: the desire to have a death without physical pain, the hope to experience a peaceful demise. But since in this new movement death is a person, a third element must be added: the desire, the obligation among her followers to please and worship her. In Spanish, the word death is a feminine noun. Her devotees call her loving names: beautiful one, skinny woman, cute girl, little mother, and even virgin. A few scholars claim that the Santa Muerte is a direct descendant of the Aztec deities of death, but she is not a symbol of fertility and abundance. And she is not a direct descendant either of the Mexicanísima Catrina, like others presume. Unlike the Catrina, made by the early 20th century artist José Guadalupe Posada, Santa Muerte is not interested in social criticism or mocking the hypocrisy of the middle class. It doesn't matter how much scholars want to establish a line of continuity, and thus some legitimacy, between the pre-Hispanic gods of death, Posadas Catrina, and the Santa Muerte. The White Lady is a modern concept. The first reference to the modern cult of Santa Muerte appears in a novel by American anthropologist Oscar Lewis, Los Hijos de Sanchez. Lewis published his story of a Mexican family in 1961. Martha, one of the characters, says, "My sister Antonia told me that when husbands are straying, you can pray to the Santa Muerte. It is a novena that should be prayed at 12 o'clock. Originally, the Santa Muerte was the one to go to rehabilitate unfaithful husbands. Lewis published his work at the beginning of the 60s, meaning that the cult existed at least since the mid-50s in the Tepido neighborhood in Mexico City. In Lewis's novel, the novena to the Santa Muerte is treated like a secret, passed by word of mouth among women. The cult stayed underground during the whole second half of the 20th century, until it exploded at the very beginning of the 21st. In 2001, on Halloween Day, a woman named Enriqueta Romero, who until then had made her income selling quesadillas, put an altar to the Santa Muerte outside her house, on Alfareros Street, in Tepido, the same neighborhood where Sanchez located his novel. Mrs. Romero opened a small shop with souvenirs, books, medals, pictures, and candles of the Holy Death. It was a roaring success. The cult didn't go unnoticed to Hollywood. In 2004 there was a brief mention in Man on Fire, a film starring Denzel Washington. But it was in 2010 when the American public had its first massive exposure to the icon, thanks to two popular TV series, Breaking Bad and Criminal Minds. What do they believe? If the Santa Muerte is a person, then who is she, according to her worshippers and followers? The Holy Death started as a character with the ability to grant any miracle, regardless of its moral value. It could be recovering a lost lover, getting a job, or protection while killing an enemy. But the central expectation is to obtain protection and shelter in a world of abandonment and insecurity, and to experience a good, painless death. Her identity is a matter of debate. Some followers theorize that she is an archangel. Others see her as a demigod, who controls the lives of all beings in the universe. Some others believe that the Santa Muerte is a soul from purgatory. Finally, there are those who see her as a demon. Ezequiel Sanchez, a well-known Catholic minister, expressed his concern in 2008 when some parishioners asked him to bless their statues of Santa Muerte. "I'm concerned about it because it's an aberration. It's a misunderstanding of faith. At the same time, I can understand why it's growing. Many people, especially Mexican immigrants, are feeling that institutions are abandoning them. Large-scale opposition has come from the Mexican government. The antagonism grew when its intelligence forces started noticing the relationship between drug trafficking and appearance of altars on highways, between ritual murders, violence, and growth of worship. Scholars also found that the cult flourished in those areas of the city where families had had members in prison. Needless to say, not everyone who follows the Santa Muerte is involved in the organized crime. There are many sincere believers, as there are in Santeria and the New Age movements, but the link between the cult and narcotrafficking, while it may not be causal, is firm. And there are of course more mundane reasons to explain the cult's success. Business opportunities. Santa Muerte is now a global business that ranges from the mass production of statues in China and Mexico to a Salvadoran seamstress working out of her Los Angeles home, making $1,000 dresses to order for Santa Muerte statues, wrote Bonifacio Krajcer for the Washington Post. Thus, rather than a romantic and ancient cult of the dispossessed, the Santa Muerte is now a massive global business, involving the chain production of statues in 2 continents, movie deals, book presentations, juicy contracts in the building industry, temples and planned cathedrals, and copyright battles. But its origins are worth an explanation. The Santa Muerte is perhaps an emotional reaction in a country terrified by death and violence. Therefore the peoples need to give her an identity, and to keep the Grim Reaper happy. A kind of Stockholm Syndrome. Posada personified death too, with a different purpose. However, death was always supposed to be a metaphor. Jose Guadalupe Posada carved his famous Catrina to mock those taking the upper class too seriously. But he knew that the skeleton was always a metaphor. Same for the Aztecs, for whom it represented cosmic forces. Perhaps it would be more uncomfortable for those who are violent if the people started asking what the symbol means and why it became a person, rather than take it literally.
Number 4.
The Amazon rainforest is home to some of the most dangerous species in the world. This emblematic and mysterious jungle has been seen as a land of secrets and dangers. However, no one expected that this place was going to be the setting of one of the darkest, brutal, and most shocking crimes in Brazilian history. In 1989, the Amazonian town of Altamira received a sudden increase of reports of missing children. Not having clear clues about the disappearances, the authorities couldn't do anything about it. By 1993, the reports rose to 19 missing children from 8 to 13 years old, with no trace or a clue to find them. By that time, the bodies of 5 children were found dead with signs of torture and castration. It was determined that these murders were connected to the medical guild, because the castration seemed to be made by a medical expert. However, other than that, there was no evidence. The authorities opened an investigation and began to connect the dots between the murders and the missing children. The bodies of the boys were identified as homeless children who worked on the streets, but most of the missing ones had been reported by their families. This fact unsettled and confused the detectives in charge of the investigation, who thought that both cases couldn't be related, because who could be so depraved? All their efforts were futile until one day one boy came to them and explained how he had escaped from his captors. There's another version stating that 2 boys managed to escape after being castrated. However, there are no official records of this, and there's only one confirmed name, Wanderlei Pinheiro, who testified in the trials. The brutality Pinheiro described seemed as if ripped from the pages of a horror novel. Some of the atrocities he suffered were torture, rape, castration, and mutilation. He also explained that other children were stabbed to death, and their organs were extracted and sold to the black market. Some unofficial versions state their captors even ate the organs, but no one has been able to confirm this. Brazilian society was shocked when Pinheiro identified them, since all were respected members of society. He named 2 doctors, a wealthy businessman, a police officer, and the leader of a religious cult, Valentina de Andrade. Valentina de Andrade was the leader of the Superior Universal Alignment UFO cult, which believed the world was coming to an end, and only those who followed her precepts could be saved. She stated she was contacted by extraterrestrial beings that warned her about the inevitable doom. However, if she spread their word, they would send a spaceship to collect all her followers. In 1981, de Andrade started preaching about these new religious precepts, which assured God doesn't exist, and Jesus was an alien Messiah who had arrived to Earth to teach us about enlightenment and love. Moreover, she was convinced that male children born after 1981 were the embodiment of evil, and they had to be exterminated as a payment to these beings who would save them. Since it all happened on a remote town, it took over 11 years to solve the case. There are no official numbers since media gave different versions, but out of the 19 missing children, 5 were never found. The authorities captured 4 of the identified captors, but de Andrade managed to flee the country. After some years, she was finally arrested, and the 5 men responsible for these murders were charged for the murders of only 5 children. However, 4 of them were prosecuted for these crimes. The leader of the group managed to escape from justice once again when she presented a very convincing alibi. She stated she wasn't in town when the murders took place. She was exonerated, and now she's happily guiding her increasing flock of followers who simply ignore these crimes. One of the main problems with religions and groups guided by these charismatic leaders is that they impose their ideals to their followers until convincing, and also forcing, them to obey their commands. Valentina de Andrade was never imprisoned because others made the dirty work. There's some sort of fascination towards crime stories and their perpetrators, up to the point that there's a museum that exhibits the impact of these cases on society.
Number 5.
A convicted rapist and cult leader known as Black Jesus, who was accused of murdering 3 girls and then eating their flesh and drinking their blood, has escaped from jail with 48 other prisoners. A huge manhunt is underway in Papua New Guinea's jungles for Stephen Tari and the other inmates, who broke out of prison in Madang in the north of the country, while a guard changed shift. Police have warned that some of the escapees are very dangerous, and stressed officers are working around the clock to catch them. Tari, 40, a failed Bible class student, called himself Black Jesus as he traveled through the highland jungles in 2006, gathering thousands of disciples who moved with him, following his instructions to increase his flock. But he was also accused of raping 3 young girls, murdering them, and then drinking their blood and eating their flesh. Villagers eventually captured him in March 2007, beat him into unconsciousness, tied him up, and handed him over to police. In 2010 he was convicted of 4 counts of rape, but was not charged with murder, due to lack of evidence, despite protests by the relatives of 3 dead girls. Now the enigmatic figure, who wore long white robes as he stood on a rock in a jungle clearing and preached his own gospel to his disciples, has sparked fears that he plans to look for new followers with his escape. The guard left his tower, PNG Correction Services spokesman Richard Manjui told Radio Australia Today. While the shift was taking place, the detainees used a tool to cut through a fence, and they left for freedom. "We're working around the clock to find Stephen Tari and the other men," said Madang's acting provincial police commander Inspector Jacob Bando. During his days of freedom, he gathered more than 6,000 disciples by telling them they would receive gifts from heaven if they followed him. But jungle communities were horrified to be told that Stephen Tari had sacrificed 3 young women, drinking their blood and eating their flesh as part of his bizarre religious ceremonies. In one case, a mother who had fallen under his influence drank her daughter's blood, according to relatives who the Daily Mail spoke to at the time. He gradually became a figure of fear. Tari was eventually captured in the small village of Matapi, a 7-hour walk from the nearest road. Church pastor Paul Makora said it had been difficult for police to catch Tari, as he never stayed for long in one place, and was always warned by his disciples when police were in the area. When he turned up in Matapi Villa, frightened villagers pounced on him while he was sleeping in a hut and tied him up. Messages were passed through villages until one man with a mobile phone was able to get a call to police in the town of Madang. Heavily armed officers found the badly beaten Tari tied to a makeshift stretcher when they arrived in the village. There was no sign of Black Jesus's bow and arrow bodyguards, who on an earlier occasion when Tari escaped, had engaged in a fight to the death with police. Now police are hoping that with the notorious Black Jesus on the run once again they will be able to recapture him, before he gets another cult up and running.
Number 6.
When Mormon church prophet and founder Joseph Smith was driven out of Kirtland, Ohio in 1937, it is said that he cursed the town in his wake. The small rural town east of Cleveland had seen the building of the first Mormon temple, and membership had flourished, but Smith also came under physical attack and left for good after a warrant was issued for his arrest. In the ensuing years, Kirtland would be besieged by ghosts, murders, and the alleged presence of melon-headed mutants. But one of the worst things to ever happen in Kirtland, Ohio, was the 1989 murders of Dennis and Cheryl Avery and their 3 daughters by cult leader Jeffrey Lundgren and his followers. Lundgren claimed to be a prophet and asked his followers to financially support him before forcing them to help him murder the Avery family. He was born on March 3, 1950, in Independence, Mississippi, and was raised as a member of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, RLDS, now known as the Community of Christ. The group is an offshoot of the larger LDS Church. In 1984, the RLDS Church began allowing women into the priesthood, a practice still forbidden in Mormonism. While this practice, and its inclusive attitude towards the LGBT community, drew liberal dissidents of the Latter-day Saints movement, it estranged more socially conservative members of the church. People like Jeffrey Lundgren and his followers, who are subjects of deadly cults, airing on Oxygen Sundays at 8/7. According to the book, The Kirtland Massacre, Lundgren enrolled at Central Missouri State University, where he met Alice Keeler, a fellow member of the RLDS Church. The two were married in 1970, after which Lundgren enrolled in the U.S. Navy, serving during the Vietnam War. He was honorably discharged in 1974, by which time he and Alice had 2 children. Lundgren struggled to support his family and often stole from his employers, according to court documents. In the early 1980s, Lundgren and his family, which now included 4 children, moved to Kirtland, Ohio, where he became a guide at the Kirtland Temple, also known as the House of the Lord. It was dedicated in 1936, according to its official website, and fell into the possession of the RLDS Church after Joseph Smith's death in 1844, when the group rallied around his son, Joseph Smith III, according to the Church of Christ website. Lundgren eventually became senior temple guide, a non-paying position which provided housing for him and his family. In this capacity, he also taught classes on the Bible and the Book of Mormon. As temple guide, Lundgren solicited and allegedly kept contributions from visitors, and the temple bookstore noted a shortage of funds, according to court documents. Officials believe he ultimately embezzled between $25,000 to $40,000 from the temple, according to Cleveland's News Herald. He was fired and the family evicted from their lodgings in October 1987. But by then Lundgren had started building a church of his own. Through his classes, Lundgren began attracting followers, including disaffected members of the RLDS Church, who were uncomfortable with its increasingly liberal social policies. In 1987, Lundgren and his adherents rented a large farmhouse where they lived communally. According to court documents, members of the group called Lundgren Dad and signed over their paychecks to him in order to pay for the group's expenses. Among Lundgren's group was a small Midwestern family, the Averys, 49-year-old Dennis Avery, his wife Cheryl, 46, and their 3 daughters, Trina, 15, Rebecca, 13, and 7-year-old Karen. They had moved from Missouri to Kirtland to join the group in 1987. Unlike other members, however, the Averys lived on their own and kept some of the proceeds from selling their home in Missouri, which Lundgren considered sinful, according to the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Despite their devotion to him, Lundgren disliked Dennis, thought Cheryl was too independent for a woman, and that the Avery children were disobedient as a whole. In 1988, Lundgren was excommunicated from the RLDS Church. By then, the sermons he delivered to his flock of about 20 turned increasingly paranoid and apocalyptic. He spoke of the end of days and insisted the men in his group begin firearms training, while he took to wearing military fatigues. According to the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Lundgren said he would bring his followers to Zion, a holy state of being, where they would witness the return of Jesus Christ. In order to set these events in motion, he said they must take over the Kirtland Temple by force on his 38th birthday. But after a disaffected member of the group informed police of his plans, Lundgren called off the attack, according to the News Herald. By early 1989, Lundgren started saying that the only way the group would reach Zion was by selling off their worldly possessions and retreating into the wilderness, according to court documents. Like others in the group, the Averys began making plans to follow Lundgren wherever the journey took them. What they didn't know is that Lundgren had told his followers the Averys must be killed as a blood sacrifice to help them reach the promised land. On the night of April 17, 1989, the Averys were invited over to the farmhouse where Lundgren and his followers lived. According to court documents, they were then led out one by one to a barn behind the house, bound and gagged, and thrown into a 6-by-7-foot pit dug out of the dirt floor, and shot 2 or 3 times with a .45 caliber semi-automatic weapon. Aiding Lundgren were his 19-year-old son Damon, and group members Ronald Luff, Daniel Kraft, Richard Brand and Greg Winship. Purely by coincidence, Kirtland police officers and members of the FBI converged on Lundgren's farm the day after the Avery murders. According to the News Herald, they were responding to complaints from neighbors about cult activities and improper use of firearms. They searched the barn, unaware they are walking over the graves of the Avery family, and left after speaking to members of the group. Afterward, Lundgren insisted the group leave the area immediately, first moving to a campsite in West Virginia, and later making their way to Missouri. In December 1989, disgruntled cult member Larry Keith Johnson went to authorities in Kansas City, Missouri, and told them about the Avery murders. According to court documents, Johnson was angry his wife Catherine had been selected by Lundgren to become his second wife in the polygamous tradition. Johnson drew a map of the barn, showing where they were buried. According to the News Herald, the Associated Press reported the Averys' bodies were discovered the first week of January 1990, setting off a nationwide manhunt for Lundgren and his remaining followers. Agents with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms and local police caught up with Lundgren on January 7, 1990. At a motel inn between San Diego and the Mexican border. According to the Los Angeles Times, Lundgren and his wife Alice had been arranging for her parents to pick up their 3 youngest children, while they planned to flee the area with son Damon and group members Katherine Johnson and Daniel Kraft. Police seized an AR-15 rifle, 3 handguns, an assortment of hunting knives and camping and survival gear in the group's possession at the time of their arrest, reported the New York Times. Besides Lundgren's wife and son, 10 other members of the cult were indicted on charges related to the murder of the 5 members of the Avery family. According to the News Herald, most would eventually plead guilty and cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for lighter sentences. In August 1990, Jeffrey Lundgren went on trial, with prosecutor Steve Latourette telling the News Herald, "We kept waiting for the insanity defense, but it never came." NBC News reported that at the trial Lundgren was unrepentant and resolute in his convictions, telling the jury, "It's not a figment of my imagination that I can in fact talk to God, and I am a prophet of God. I am even more than a prophet." On August 29, after deliberating for 2 hours, the jury found Lundgren guilty on 5 counts each of aggravated murder and kidnapping. A few weeks later, he was sentenced to death. In addition to Jeffrey Lundgren, his wife Alice and son Damon would also be sentenced to life in prison on aggravated murder and kidnapping charges, as would Ronald Luff and Daniel Kraft, who were in the barn when the Averys were shot dead. Richard Brand and Greg Winship pleaded guilty and were paroled in 2010, after spending nearly 20 years behind bars, as were cult members Sharon Blunchley, Susan Luff and Deborah Olivares. Katherine Johnson was sentenced to a year in prison after pleading guilty to obstruction of justice, and was released in 1991 after serving 7 months. After exhausting all legal appeals, Jeffrey Lundgren was executed by lethal injection on October 24, 2006. Fox News reported at the time that in his final statement he said, "I profess my love for God, my family, for my children, for second wife Kathy. I am because you are."
Number 7.
Lorraine Borowski was up bright and early for work May 15, 1982. The effervescent 21-year-old loved her job as secretary at a real estate office in the Chicago suburbs. Her childhood friend Liz Soriano tells A&E True Crime, slipping on a pair of fashionable high heels, Borowski collected her keys, stepped outside and walked into evil. Borowski's workplace was a short distance from her apartment. As she approached the office, strong hands grabbed the 21-year-old, dragged her into a van and sped off. The shoes and keys were scattered on the sidewalk outside her office, evidence of a brief, desperate struggle. The perpetrators drove to a nearby motel, where Borowski was raped and killed. The crime was the work of the Ripper Crew, a satanic cult and gang who, in the 1980s, abducted and murdered multiple women at random in the Chicago area until authorities apprehended them. Thomas Kokorales, one of 4 men involved in the killing spree, was released from prison March 29, 2019, horrifying victims' families. He served half of his 70-year sentence after pleading guilty to Borowski's death. "I hoped this day would never come," Borowski's brother Mark said at the time. Kokorales, now 59, lives at a Christian shelter that offers training and guidance for ex-offenders in Aurora, Illinois. But his release, which has provoked protests in the community, raises questions in criminologist circles about recidivism. "It is very difficult for people in my field to predict future dangerousness. There's not a reliable or valid test you can give someone," psychologist Stanton Salmonell tells A&E True Crime. Andrew Kokorales, Thomas's brother, was convicted of Borowski's murder and executed at age 35 in 1999. Robin Jecht, now 66, alleged ringleader of the gang, and accomplice Edward Spreitzer, now 59, remain in prison. But between spring 1981 and fall 1982, the Ripper Crew prowled the streets of Chicago and suburban DuPage County unimpeded, snatching lone women, then sexually assaulting and killing them, police and prosecutors said. The group's nickname, coined by police, recalls the notorious 1800s British serial killer Jack the Ripper. Authorities estimate the men brutalized up to 20 women. In some cases, the victims' breasts were cut off and used in satanic rituals. Records show this would take place in Jecht's attic, which the group referred to as their satanic chapel. Among the victims was single mother Linda Sutton, 26, thought to be the first murdered. Sutton was abducted on May 23, 1981, in Chicago. A week later, her handcuffed, body was found in a suburban field. Another victim, Shuey Mack, 30, argued with her brother while driving home from work at their family restaurant on May 29, 1982. Mack rushed from the car in Hanover Park, Illinois, and vanished. Her beaten body turned up in a suburban construction site 4 months later. Rose Beck Davis, 30, a marketing executive, was seized September 8, 1982 in Chicago. Her body, slashed by hatchet wounds, was discovered in the city's posh Gold Coast neighborhood that day. Borowski's mutilated remains were found in a DuPage County cemetery October 10, 1982. She had been stabbed to death with an ice pick or knife, experts said. On October 6, 1982, an 18-year-old Chicago woman was raped, knifed and abandoned along the railway tracks on the city's west side. The survivor provided the first big break in the case. Her statements and accounts from other witnesses led investigators to Jecht and Spreitzer, plus Andrew and Thomas Kokorales in October and November of 1982. Under questioning, Thomas Kokorales offered gruesome details such as how body parts were amputated that appalled veteran police investigators. Thomas Kokorales' defense attorney portrayed him as a follower who was mentally deficient, but a former law enforcement official familiar with the case tells A&E True Crime that Kokorales appeared cognizant of his conduct and acknowledged that some of his actions were wrong. Spreitzer and the Kokorales brothers told police they had killed up to 20 women, often under the influence of alcohol and drugs. That tally has never been confirmed. Jecht was convicted of sexual assault and aggravated kidnapping in the case of the 18-year-old, and is eligible for parole in 2042. According to the Illinois Department of Corrections, Spreitzer was found guilty of Sutton's murder and has a life sentence. At Wayside Cross Ministries in Aurora, Thomas Kokorales works hard at his chores and his recovery. Executive Director James Lucas tells A&E True Crime. When he first met Kokorales, we had an open conversation about his faith. I strongly believed he has received Christ as his Lord. Since then, it's been a long life journey. Kokorales, who has been baptized and attends a local church, was honored as Resident of the Month by his fellows. He's a free man. He can go anytime he wants. There's no limitations imposed on him, Lucas says. Is there a scientific consensus about recidivism among serial killers, or in this case, serial killers who worked in groups? Not that I know of, says Salmonell. author of Inside the Criminal Mind. In fact, studies of whether convicted murderers kill again after being released from prison are scarce. Iowa State University researchers found in a study published in Forensic Science International, Synergy in February 2019, the difficulty assessing whether someone with a murderous past is safe to return to society is that people like this are pros at lying to people like myself, Samino says. He cited David Carpenter, the trailside killer who murdered at least 5 people in 1980 in San Francisco area parks, after serving 2 separate prison terms for violent crimes between 1960 and 1979. Carpenter was considered a model candidate to go out on probation. He ran counseling groups in prison. Samino says, prisons and group homes offer a controlled setting for serial criminals, but once an offender is on their own, they must cope with the inevitable frustrations in life that occur to people. Samino notes. For Cacorles, the question is, who will he choose to associate with? How will he handle situations that don't go his way? What if he feels bored or depressed? Samino asks. Cacorles was originally sentenced to life in prison for Borowski's murder, but his conviction was overturned because of legal errors. At the original trial, a psychiatrist described him as someone with low intelligence, who was easily swayed by authority figures. But even if Cacorles was a patsy misled by other Ripper crew members, and has since reformed, some officials feel he shouldn't have been released from prison. His residency is a risk the people of Aurora shouldn't have to take, the town's mayor, Richard C. Irvin, said in a 2019 statement. Among the items in Borowski's purse the day she died was a copy of her favorite poem, Hurt No Living Thing, by Christina Georgina Rossetti, remembers Suriano, who grew up with Laurie in Elmhurst, Illinois. It begins with, hurt no living thing, ladybird, nor butterfly. Laurie loved butterflies. She had butterfly earrings and necklaces. Suriano recalls. Family and friends are raising money to open a butterfly garden in Laurie's name. She was the type of person who could make people laugh very easily. She sensed when someone was having an off day and would gravitate to them. She'd crack jokes and make them smile. Suriano says. When Borowski died, the college graduate was blossoming, with her own apartment, a boyfriend, and dreams of a career as a real estate professional. The loss is still raw, Suriano says. It's like it happened yesterday.
Number 8.
Glenn Taylor Heltzer believed himself to be a prophet. He had big plans to change the world and defeat evil once and for all. But there were 3 things his plans lacked: funding, followers, and an ability to improvise an effective backup plan if things went wrong. And boy, did things go wrong. You would think that a self-proclaimed prophet like Glenn Heltzer might have foreseen all of his grand plans going to crap in such spectacular fashion. But hey, the Heltzer brothers, and the start of Children of Thunder brothers Glenn and Justin Heltzer, along with their sister, were raised in a devout Mormon household. Glenn was very much the golden child of the family. He was very charismatic, and people were drawn to his magnetic personality, which served him well in his duties within the LDS Church. Justin, on the other hand, was much more timid and reserved. He may not have been the favorite, but he always looked up to Glenn, and was always willing to go along with whatever adventures his big bro had in store. After high school, Glenn served in the National Guard for a while, then went on a Mormon mission trip to Brazil, where the locals absolutely loved him. Upon his return to the US, Glenn took a job as a stockbroker, got married, and had a couple of kids. Over the next 3 years, he got really into a self-help program called Impact Training, which seriously lit a fire under Glenn's ass to accomplish all of his goals in life. The problem is, this was around the same time in his life that he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, severe enough to qualify him for disability, so a lot of the goals in Glenn's head were a bit out there. After separating from his wife, Glenn started engaging in a lot of behavior the LDS Church did not approve of: drinking, doing drugs, and partying. Of course, Justin rode along as his wingman through all of this, which led to both brothers being excommunicated from the church. This is what led to Glenn deciding to start his own religion, the Children of Thunder. Member count, just Glenn and Justin. But that'll soon change. The cult membership reaches a total of 3 over Memorial Day weekend in 1999. Glenn and Justin, attended a Mormon-sponsored murder mystery dinner in Walnut Creek, California. Seeing as both brothers had both been excommunicated from the church at this point, their appearance at the dinner was apparently a bit of a scandal. Most reports we found about it said the brothers, brace yourself, showed up dressed all in black. At this dinner, the pair met Dawn Godman, who was feeling like a bit of an outcast at the dinner herself. She was new to the church, socially awkward, and conveyed the kind of vulnerability that charismatic cult leaders like Glenn like to exploit. Dawn soon started dating Justin, later moving into the brothers' house, at which point she was sleeping with both of them, becoming the third official member of the Children of Thunder cult. Let that be a warning to everyone. Nothing good really happens at a murder mystery dinner. Granted, this is a worst-case scenario here, but as far as entertainment goes, it's generally just not worth it. Just stay home and play a game of Clue with a couple of failed theater majors while eating cheesecake. You'll have just as much fun, and you probably won't get recruited for a death cult. About the cult for him and his followers to adhere to, Glenn Heltzer developed a list he titled 12 Principles of Magic, which already makes it sound like an indestructible book held in a locked chamber at Hogwarts that no one's allowed to read. We're gonna share these principles with you now, but to prevent any of our readers from falling under Heltzer's spell, we're going to annotate these rules with sarcasm. 1. I am already perfect and therefore can do nothing wrong. 2. There is no such thing as right and wrong. 3. I am all-powerful and therefore the creator of and accountable for everything that occurs in my life. We're not sure how this mindset would work out in a cult setting, but these first 3 rules pretty much nailed what would eventually become the respective business models of Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit. 4. Life is always right. I embrace all of my results. 5. All of my results I have created to learn from, at some level. By the end of this story, those 2 rules will prove to be quite ironic. 6. I know nothing, I believe nothing, I simply perceive without fear. Yeah, no, duh, on the first part. 7. It is of no concern to me how accurate, or inaccurate, my perceptions are, and therefore I am always right. We were wondering if he was also gonna predict Facebook. 8. Unconditional fearless love is the most powerful force in the universe. Well, someone's obviously never tried frozen peanut and Ms. 9. Spirit knows. 10. I gain total control by losing all control. We all knew that this list was gonna have some pointless fluff to get it up to an even dozen, but this is below-level amounts of useless padding. 11. Life is such a precious gift, and when I give back to life, immediately life gives more back to me, and therefore I am forever in its debt. What goes around comes around. 12. There is a higher power than mine, and that is my Savior, Jesus Christ, the Son of my Father. It wouldn't be a real religion without some sort of vaguely threatening statement, like what goes around comes around being immediately followed by a shout out to the Lord. Payback's a bitch, ain't it? Anyway, Almighty God, hear our prayers. But this was just the start of Glenn Heltzer's big plan for the Children of Thunder, Wringing Hands, and the world. The 12 Principles of Magic was what would get everyone on the same page. The next step was to take mission trips to Brazil to volunteer with orphans. You know what? We're just gonna take a break in our research right there and reflect on what a beautiful gesture that was for the cult to do for those children. We're sure there are no sinister motives behind it. Now, to take a long drink of this beverage and continue reading about this Brazilian orphan idea. They wanted to train the orphans to assassinate Mormon leaders, so that Heltzer could install himself as the leading prophet of the LDS Church. That's a haluva step 2. Once Heltzer installed himself as head of the church, his third step was almost more evil. He wanted to start his own self-help movement. Heltzer called his movement Transform America. The group's goal was to unite everyone in a state of peace and joy in order to hasten the return of Jesus Christ and defeat Satan once and for all. Don't get us wrong here, that is a noble goal, but part of what brings new people into these movements is the success story of their leader. Just saying. When part of that leader's backstory involves brainwashing a squad of Brazilian child soldiers, it wouldn't have the same if I can do it. So can you? Vibe of your typical Tony Robbins seminar, would it? But in order to put any of these plans in motion, Heltzer would need some seed money to get his cult startup off the ground. This really wasn't the kind of money you could ask for at the bank. without the loan officer frantically smashing the panic button under their desk. Although, to be fair, it wouldn't have been the worst pitch for Shark Tank. As always, Glenn Heltzer had an idea, several, in fact. The first idea for raising money was to start up a high-end prostitution ring, and then blackmail their wealthiest clientele. Okay, you can't expect the first idea out of the gate to be the winner, but this is early in the brainstorming session, so let's see what else he's got. The second idea, trade stocks in a chain of fast food restaurants, and then manipulate the stock price by damaging property and calling in fake threats. Dude, really? Maybe we should steer this in a direction with a little more fiscal stability. Stealing catalytic converters, perhaps. Third idea, extort money from 5 of Glenn's former clients from when he worked as a stockbroker, and then kill them and feed them to the dogs. Whoa, dial it back a bit on the evil a bit there. Oh, they actually ran with this one. Alright, step 1. Get 3 dogs. Glenn Heltzer convinced his girlfriend, that's right, Dawn was just his side piece, Selena Bishop, to open up a bank account in her name that Glenn also had access to. He told her that he was about to inherit a bunch of money soon, and he needed to keep it all hidden from his ex-wife in those accounts. Why wasn't Selena a member of the cult? Well, she was never intended to be a part of the long-term plan. Once all of the money was collected and fully laundered, they were going to, sever ties with Selena. Selena didn't even know Glenn's real name. She only knew him as Jordan. By the way, Selena Bishop was the daughter of famed blues guitarist Elvin Bishop. Probably his most famous song was the 1976 hit song Fooled Around and Fell in Love, and we only really mention it because if we gotta think of this murder victim every time we watch the first Guardians of the Galaxy. So do you. Glenn Heltzer had 5 former clients in mind, and since their first intended target wasn't home, they went for number 2 on the list, Ivan and Annette Steinman, a retired couple from Concord, California. On July 30, 2000, Glenn and Justin dressed up in their finest suits and knocked on the Steinmans' door, just as they used to when they went door to door for the Mormon church back in the day. Once they were inside the house, they held the couple at gunpoint. Glenn forced the couple to take 6 pills of Rohypnol each, and then made them write him, well, technically Selena, a series of checks totaling $100,000. According to Don Godman's testimony, Annette Steinman was unable to finish filling out checks because the drugs were putting her to sleep. Well, you just gave her enough roofies to stun a rhino. And what was their plan for waking her up? Forcing her to smoke meth. By the way, this woman was 78 years old. When the meth didn't work, Dawn forged the last of the checks herself. The trio then killed and dismembered the Steinmans, making sure to destroy anything that might aid in identifying the bodies, like crushing the victim's teeth with a hammer. But it turns out Glenn's dogs weren't as hungry as they thought they would be. Or maybe they weren't in the mood for benzodiazepine septuagenarian tartar with a hint of methamphetamine. So they stuffed the remains in 6 duffel bags, loaded them up in the Steinmans' van, and set out to toss the bags in a nearby river. Then they sent Dawn to the bank to try to deposit the checks, and for some reason, they decided to have her do this while in a wheelchair and wearing a lime green tracksuit, silver hat, red boots, and a huge pair of sunglasses, to keep a low profile.